on how to write the domain and range in interval notation given the graph. I'm going to go through these instructions step by step, and as I read one step, I will be performing those steps on the graphs below here, these two examples. So the first item here says that we need to add arrows to all ends of the graph that have no filled or open circles. So I'm going to go down to my graphs here and find the ends. This graph here has the end. I'm going to end the arrow. It does not have a circle, filled, or open. And right here also we're going to add the arrow. This graph here, the one in blue, does not have any ends without the circle, so I want to skip this step for the blue graph, and we're going to move into step number 1 specifically for the domain. So step number 1 says, find the point that is the furthest point on the left, determine the x of that point if it has an arrow, write negative infinity. So let's look at the point that is furthest on the left on the black graph. It's this point right here. And this point does have the arrow, which the directions tell me to go ahead and write negative infinity for my domain. Let's read the second step. Find the point that is the furthest on the right. Determine the x of that point. If it has an arrow, write positive infinity. So for our black graph here, the furthest point on the right is this one right here. And it does have an arrow again, so I will go ahead and write positive infinity. Let's move on to step 3. Step 3 is here, and it says separate the two numbers above with the comma. So I'm just going to put the comma in between my infinities here. Step 4, if the point is negative infinity, positive infinity, or it has an open circle, we're going to give it a parenthesis. So both of ours are infinities, we're going to give them parentheses. And then this does not apply to our black graph, but if the point was in the middle of the graph or had a filled circle, then we're going to give that number a square bracket. But I'm going to repeat steps 1, 2, 3, and 4, and potentially 5 with my blue graph here. So we'll start by placing ourselves in the point that is furthest on the left. For the blue graph, it's this point right here. And I need to determine the x of that point. Let's go back to the steps. Find the point that is the furthest on the left, determine the x of that point, and if it has an arrow, write negative infinity. Well, this does not have an arrow, and what I need to determine is the x of this point that is furthest on the left. The x of this point is negative 3. So that's the first side of my domain. Step 2 here says find the point that is the furthest on the right, determine the x of that point. If it has an arrow, write infinity. So the furthest point on the right for this blue graph is right here, and the x of that point is positive 2. So that is the second side of my domain, and remember we will be separating them with the comma just like I did with the infinities. Now we need to decide if they get brackets or parentheses. So I'm going to go back to the steps here. So we already did 3, 4. If the point had negative infinity, infinity, or has an open circle, then we're going to give it a parenthesis. Those are the only 3 options: negative infinity, positive infinity, or it has an open circle. So let's look at our 2 points here that I have highlighted in yellow. This one here does not have an arrow or an open circle. So this will not get a parenthesis, this negative 3. It will get a square bracket. But 2 was not an arrow but had an open circle. So I'm going to give it a parenthesis. We're done with the domains. The range is very, very similar. can I have the steps here? And it's basically exactly the same. But instead of finding the point that is furthest on the left and on the right, we will be finding the lowest point and then the highest point. So I'm going to be highlighting in green. The lowest point for the black graph is -2. Excuse me, the lowest point for the black graph is this green point right here. And I will now be determining the y of that point. The y of this point that I have highlighted in green is -1. That's the first part of the range, -1. Because this point is not an open circle and it's not an arrow, I will give -1 a bracket. The highest point on my graph, well, actually I have two, they're right here. And those points have arrows. If the point has an arrow, we write infinity, and infinity will have a parenthesis because that's what item 4 here says. So this here was our domain from left to right, and this is our range from bottom to the top. For the blue graph, we'll start at the lowest point again. The lowest point on the graph is this right here, and the y of that point is -5. So that's the first part of my range. Again, this was the domain, and this is the range. So -5 is where we begin. That point here didn't have an arrow or an open circle, so -5 will get a square bracket. And then the highest point on the graph is this one right here. It's tempting to say this one here, but no, it's actually the one on the top here. And the y of that point is a 4. So that's the second side of my range. This point right here does not have an open circle or an arrow, so 4 will also get a square bracket, and that's it.